Happy Tuesday to you. Remember yesterday, Jesus was talking about the violent taking the kingdom by force and causing it to suffer violence. In other words, there were people that wanted to be in charge of God's people, and they didn't have the right to do so. And then along came the forerunner and the king who had the right to rule. And that's what the kingdom is all about. And that's why Jesus said, John the Baptist is the Elijah that you were expecting, and I'm the king that he was announcing. And there's no violently taking it by force, but instead he lays his life down for sinners and rises from the dead, and then salvation is proclaimed in his name. Well, unbelief was what these guys had, these violent ones that were trying to take it by force. And have you noticed that unbelief never has enough evidence, and that unbelief makes its own rules? Jesus was saying this generation, and when you're talking about this generation, sometimes you're talking about just a period of time or a certain group of people that have come from another group of people, but sometimes you're talking about a particular group of people at a particular time. And so when Jesus is talking about this generation, in this case, he's talking about the violent ones trying to take the kingdom by force and not believing that Jesus is really the Christ because they don't want to. And so he says they're like little kids that want to be in charge, and they name the game that they're going to play, and you have to play their game or something's wrong with you. He says here, what will I compare this generation, these unbelievers that are pushy bullies? They're like children sitting in the marketplaces calling out to other children and saying, we played the flute for you and you didn't dance. And we sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. What does that mean? Well, we played wedding. We said, let's all play wedding, and you didn't play wedding. And then we said, let's all play funeral, and you wouldn't play funeral. Who was making the rules? Well, they were. So who do they think they were? But you know what people do today? They'll say, I'll believe in Jesus if. God's got to do this. God's got to answer this question. God's got to answer that question. God's going to explain to me why things are this way or why they're that way. Or if he'll just show me a little bit more, I'll believe. You know, when Jesus fed 5,000 families, then went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, some of those very people that were fed miraculously on one side of the Sea of Galilee said to Jesus, what kind of sign do you have to show us that you really are who you say you are? How much more did they need? You know, after the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead, after he'd been dead 4 days, they still didn't believe. It's because they wanted to make the rules. They wanted everybody to play their game by their rules. You know what? God makes the rules. And God says, you know enough to believe. You go by his rules. And he says, Jesus has been crucified and raised from the dead, and witnesses have seen it, and you know enough. So it's time for you to lay that position of leadership aside and humble yourself and come to this Jesus by faith. God bless you. All done.